Today we're installing the SafeLogic Xtreme from SecureM Systems. This is an electromechanical, EMP-proof, redundant lock system. Christine's going to help us with the installation. The first step in installing the SafeLogic Xtreme is to open the safe door. Now with the safe door open, we're going to turn the handle so the bolts are extended, and that will ensure that during the installation process we don't accidentally close the door. Now we're going to remove the back panel of the safe door by undoing the screws. They're held on in a variety of different ways. This one happens to have screws around the perimeter, so we'll go ahead and remove the back panel. Alright, with the back panel removed, we can now see the bolt work as well as the existing safe lock that's installed, and we're going to now remove the lock. Now that we've got the back panel of the safe door off, you can see the lock is mounted on a mounting plate here, and we have a relocker plate which is holding a relocker pin in place. The purpose of the relocker pin is to ensure that the safe is secure even if the lock is punched off through the spindle hole. So if this lock were to be punched off, this relocker plate would disengage with the relocker pin, and the pin would fire into this hole, which would prevent the bolt work from being operated and would leave your safe secure even if the lock was removed. So now we'll ask Christine to remove the relocker plate and disengage the relocker pin. Perfect. So you can see the relocker pin has a spring-loaded position here. When it's in its spring-loaded position, it's held up. When when the lock would be punched off, the relocker would fire and it would prevent the bolt work from being operated. So we're just going to move that out of the way for the time being so that we can uninstall the lock. Now that the relocker plate's removed from the lock body, we'll remove the lock body from its mounting plate. First, disconnect the keypad cable. And now undo the 3 screws that hold the lock body in place. Great. Now let's set the lock body aside, and we'll go to the front side of the safe in order to remove the keypad. Now from the front of the safe, remove the keypad. This is usually done just by pushing up on the keypad itself. And remove. Now we'll remove the screws that we're holding on the entry pad. So now we're ready to install the new SafeLogic Xtreme. There are 2 components in the box, the entry pad portion and the lock body. First we're going to work with the entry pad. So the first thing you want to do is ensure that this screw has been loosened so that you can remove the electronic components from the dial ring. And how we do that is raise this spin dial release and then pull the entry pad component off. You'll see on the back of the entry pad there's a battery box for your battery, but we want to work first with the dial ring portion of the entry pad, which is this portion here. In the hardware kit that comes with the SafeLogic Xtreme, you'll see a spindle that is extra long. You'll need to cut that to length, and then there's 2 small brass colored screws that are used to hold the dial ring on. There's a change key, and there's 3 lock mounting bolts. And then finally there's a small silver screw or bolt that is used to hold the spindle to the dial ring. So with these accessories we're going to now assemble the SafeLogic Xtreme on the safe. So now as we begin the installation process, there's a couple of things we have to do. We have to measure the width of the door from where the keypad mounts on the front of the door to where the lock mounts on the back of the door. And we're going to use the spindle that Christine has here to show you how to do that. So insert the spindle through the spindle hole, and what you want to do is make sure that the spindle is flush with the outside of the door, just like that. Now, with the spindles threaded through the door, we're on the inside of the door now, and we will just mark where the spindle reaches the inside of the mounting plate. So that mark that Christine's putting there is actually the thickness of the door, and we'll use that to cut the spindle as well as the plastic tube. Now we're ready to install the dial ring on the front of the safe door. First, we're going to thread the lock cable from the dial ring through the spindle hole, which we've done there, and now we'll position the dial ring in the spindle hole and pull through the excess cable into the interior of the safe. Now that we've got it positioned, we're now going to use the brass-colored screws in order to install the dial ring on the front of the safe door. And these screws can be tightened, not all the way down. I would say tighten them down and then back them off about a turn, because we'll want to align the dial ring with the mechanical lock on the interior. So that's good. Now that the first screw is installed holding the dial ring in place, we need to fix the second screw, and that's done by rotating the dial ring 90 degrees so that you can line up the holes to gain access to the dial ring securement location. So now we install the second screw. And again, we're going to tighten this one down and then back it off about a turn. Perfect. It's now time to cut the clear plastic tube that came with your accessory pack. The clear plastic tube is designed to isolate the movement of the spindle as the mechanical lock opens and protect the lock cable on the electronic side. So we need to measure this for the door thickness, the thickness of the door that we measured previously with the spindle. So using the spindle marking that we had previously, we'll mark the tube, and now using a pair of scissors, we simply cut the tube at that length. And that'll be the correct length to be able to protect the lock cable while the spindle is being turned using the mechanical code. It's now time to install the lock body. So the first thing we have to do is install the clear plastic tube that will protect that lock cable as it comes through the spindle hole. So you push that all the way through, and it's going to hang outside of the mounting plate about 3/8 of an inch. That 3/8 of an inch will then join into the back of the lock in that recessed hole where the spindle goes. And we also note that there are channels here for the lock cable to run in. So what we want to do is now orient the lock cable so that it'll run through this channel when we install the lock. So we're just going to tape that cable up in this position in order to allow us to easily handle that cable running through the channel. And now we're going to go ahead and install the lock. There are 3 screws that come with the lock, and we can just install those. We always recommend using a standard screwdriver as opposed to a power driver when we're installing a lock. It just gives you a little bit more control. And what we also do is we tighten the locks diagonally across the face of the lock, so that you tighten the first one and then move down to the bottom corner and tighten the next one. And this just ensures that we have even pressure on the lock body. Alright, so now the lock body's installed, and the next step will show you how to align the cam to receive the spindle. Now that the lock is installed, we're going to install the spindle. But before we do that, it's very important, and please don't miss this step, but it's very important to ensure that the dial ring is aligned at 0. So I'm just going to move closely here, and you can see that we've aligned it to 0. And now we'll close the spin dial release, and now that's locked at 0. And that's very important in order to orient the spindle correctly in the lock. It's now time to cut the spindle to length. You remember we measured the thickness of the door using the spindle. We marked that previously at the thickness of the door. Now what we need to do is add 1 3/4 inches to that length in order to properly size the spindle. So we'll line that mark up with 1 3/4 inches, and then we'll mark off an additional 1 3/4 inches, and that's the length that we'll cut the spindle. Now that we have the lock mounted on the mounting plate, we have to make sure that the cam inside the lock for the mechanical lock portion of the Xtreme is oriented correctly with the dial. So we've provided an easy way to ensure this cam is oriented correctly. There are 3 locator holes on the back of the lock body, and in these holes you should see a full head of a Phillips screw. This, as long as you have the screws lined up in these locator holes, then your cam will be oriented correctly when you put the spindle in. If they're not oriented correctly, partially insert the spindle in order to turn the cam until you see those 3 screws line up in those 3 locator holes. With the cam oriented correctly, it's now time to insert the spindle. The spindle has one end that is drilled and tapped to receive a bolt. The other end we've cut off, obviously. We want to install the drilled and tapped hole first into the spindle insertion point, and then push that all the way through until it stops. And it should be flush with the case. So that's installed correctly. At this point, the spindle has been installed, and now we're going to install the bolt that ties the spindle to the dial ring. This is the silver bolt that's included in your accessory package. So just screw that in until you get it tight. Good. Now that the spindle has been installed, we're now going to tighten down the small Phillips head screws that were in the locator holes. And what this does is it clamps the cam against the spindle so that it's fixed at the spindle location as well. Make sure those are tightened down, and then the cam will be able to turn freely. If you find when you're turning the spin dial that it is binding, chances are one of these screws have not been screwed down tight enough. The next step is to ensure that the dial ring is being able to be rotated freely without binding. So raise the spin dial release and turn manually the spin dial in order to ensure it's not binding anywhere. And that looks good. So now what we want to do is we want to tighten up those 2 screws that are holding on the entry pad. So we'll line up those holes again like we did previously, and then we'll use a screwdriver to tighten down those dial ring bolts. That's good. Good. And now return it to 0 and snap down the spin dial release. Okay. Now it's time to install the electronic component that manages the electronic code of the SafeLock. First thing you'll notice is on the back of the entry pad there is a battery box where 9-volt batteries to fit. On the very bottom of the battery box you'll see an embossed marking showing you positive and negative. Make sure you line the battery up correctly with the positive terminal, and let's slide the battery in. You want to slide the battery in so that it connects with the spring coil contacts. And now what we're going to do is raise the spin dial release on the entry pad, and now we'll put the entry pad onto the hub of the spin dial. It snaps in place. Now we'll rotate to the number 50, and we'll just tighten down the battery screw. There are 2 magnets inside the entry pad that hold the entry pad onto the dial ring, even if this screw is not fastened down, but it just allows us to ensure that it stays there while you position the screw to be able to screw it down and fasten the entry pad onto the dial ring. So now we'll rotate it back to 0, and we will close the spin dial release. Now let's go ahead and test the electronic combination of the SafeLogic Xtreme. Pressing the clear button or any button lights up the backlit touchpad, and now you enter the default code of 123456. You'll hear the motor turns, and now you can unlock the safe. Works exactly as designed. Now that we've installed the SafeLogic Xtreme and tested the electronic combination, it's time to test the mechanical combination. So you do that by raising the spin dial release, and on the spin dial release you'll see that there are numbers here. So 0, 10, 20, 30, and so on. So to test the mechanical combination, all numbers are set on 50. So each wheel is set at 50. So we rotate 4 times to the left to 50. So that's once, twice, 3 times, and on the 4th time we're going to stop at 50, and you want to slow down to get to that number. So we're at 30, and stop right on 50, and then rotate back to the right until it stops. And the safe lock is open. Now that we've unlocked the safe lock using the mechanical combination, we'll show you how to resecure your safe when you've used the mechanical combination. First, you'll want to rotate the dial at least once, but it's best practice to rotate it at least 4 times to the left. This will scramble all of the wheels of the combination so that no one knows that any of the lines of the wheels are lined up. And we go back to 0, and then we re-engage the spin dial release, and we're back in electronic mode. Now for probably the most important part of this installation of the safe lock, and that is the repositioning of the relocker plate onto the safe lock body. The purpose of the relocker plate is to hold this spring-loaded pin in place so that if someone were to attack this safe and remove the entry pad and knock this lock off through the spindle hole, this pin would fire down through this hole and prevent this blocking mechanism from moving and opening the safe. So even with the lock off the safe, this mechanism is designed to protect the contents of the safe. So it's very important that we get this positioned correctly on the safe for 2 reasons. One, to protect your contents, but secondly, if this is not positioned correctly, even if the lock is working, it still won't allow you to open it if this pin is engaged with this bar. So first thing we need to do is to take these 2 screws out that hold the relocker plate from the lock body, and then position this relocker plate such that it holds this pin up out of the way of this engagement with this hole on the slide bar. So we can do that. We've pre-drilled this plate to be able to do this, and we're going to engage the plate with the pin, and now we're going to install the relocker plate screws. Put one there. Okay, and now we'll do the second relocker plate screw into the back of the lock. Alright, now, so this pin is well engaged in this plate. It's held in securely by the 2 screws, and we have a lot of clearance. We have about a 1/4 inch clearance, but it's still engaged with this lower portion of the relocker pin system. So that will be held out of the way. It's really important that you make sure that this pin is clearing this slide bar. The installation is almost complete. The final step in the installation of the SafeLogic Xtreme is to make sure that you test the electronic and mechanical combinations at least 3 times before closing the safe door. So we've installed the back of the back panel on the back of the door, and now we're just going to go ahead and test the combination and open the handle. And you'll see that the lock opens as designed. After 6 seconds it'll relock again. You heard the motor relock. Now we'll test it one more time. And you can see you can either press the clear button or not, it doesn't matter. As soon as you touch any of the numbers, that's going to be assumed to be part of your code. And it's locked again, and we'll test it one more final time. And this time Christine will close the safe door. And close again. And that's the SafeLogic Xtreme from Secure M Systems.